Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. And this time we're returning to the Meeting Drac page. So as you can see, we're just very easily editing the text, but you saw briefly flash up the little plus symbols. That allows you to insert other things without ruining the formatting of everything else. So move the Italy trip, announce that I am heading to Northern Europe at some point in 2025, and then I can look at putting in a picture. So you see I just hit the plus symbol, select photo, upload the image, and without ruining any formatting, up goes a little screenshot of a Google map showing the route. So I'll be going to Dunkirk, the Ram Buffel in Rotterdam, the Den Helder Museum in the Netherlands, and yes, I've been there before, but this time I'll have better camera equipment, the Marine Museum in Wilhelmshaven, the Type 21 U-boat in Bremerhaven, the Błyskawice over all the way there in Poland, U-995, the frigate Jylland in Denmark, and the Seawar Museum in Jutland, but you'll see there's two double question marks because, well, I need something channel related that I can visit between Bremerhaven and Gdansk, otherwise that's an extremely long drive, and I'm also going to be doing some additional stuff in Denmark. So there you go, edited nice, quick and easy, all in Squarespace. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Almost all battleships in World War II worked on the same basic principle of protection, a big slab of face-hardened steel armour. Some had their armour mounted on the outside of the hull, some had their armour belt internal, some had their plates mostly flat, others deliberately angled them. But the armour plate itself was almost always that same basic concept of a big lump of steel. Except for the Italians. During the interwar period, the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, was trying to find a way to protect its proposed new battleships against incoming shell fire, but in a way that would give greater protection without the corresponding increase in weight that would result from simply slapping on a bunch more steel. Note that this was not because of a limitation on the Italian steel industry's ability to make thicker armour. The Littorio's turrets, for example, had 15 inches of armour on their faces. It was just an attempt to save weight generally, because weight saved on armour was weight that you could use in something else. But ever since, there have been discussions as to whether or not their solution actually worked, not helped by the fact that no Littorio was ever struck on its belt armour by an incoming enemy shell during the Second World War. Unfortunately, the physics and the engineering involved is somewhat more complex than standard battleship plate armour, and this means that some people on both sides of the argument deeply misunderstand what they're actually talking about. There are some who say it just didn't work at all, and the Italians would have been better off just having the 11-inch thick internal layer. That's not correct. But there's also some who say, well, no, the Italians tested it and it worked, and therefore it works as advertised, and anyone who questions it is just being silly. And they're also wrong, because, well, we'll find out. After some thinking and experimentation, the idea that the Italians settled on was to rely on what is known as decapping incoming projectiles. As you'll hopefully recall from the video that we did on shells versus armour, and if you don't recall that, there's a good chance to go and watch that video again, an incoming armour-piercing shell consists, at least in World War II, of three primary components. A windscreen, which is present purely for aerodynamic purposes and gives it a long pointy appearance, and has negligible importance in terms of armour penetration. Then there is a hardened armour-piercing cap, which in very brief terms essentially sacrifices itself to inflict maximum damage on the armour plate without causing the main body of the shell to suffer damage. And then you have the shell's main body, which contains the explosive charge and is capable of a certain amount of penetration itself because it is the primary mass of the shell, but it is made of a slightly softer steel that is better at holding itself together, but less capable of punching through face-hardened armour, as compared to the steel the AP cap is made of. Now, the armour-piercing, or AP cap, had been introduced to naval shells a little bit prior to World War I, largely in response to armour thickness and material getting good enough to be able to relatively easily resist an incoming shell that was just made up of a shell body and a windscreen. A softer-bodied shell would just collapse, concertina up like an accordion, and a harder-bodied one would shatter, assuming that you had a reasonable thickness of armour on your ship. Hence, the armour-piercing cap was invented, which essentially, again very briefly, split the problem of absolute penetration and coherent payload delivery into two individually solvable tasks. Due to their disposable nature, as well as certain physical interactions that required the cap and body to be somewhat separated to work, armour-piercing caps were only held on to the shell bodies by relatively minimal means. In some places, small contact points, in other cases, light soldering, in some other cases still, a little bit of crimping, and in a few cases, some combination of the above. So, it seemed obvious that if you could come up with a method to detach the cap from the shell prior to the shell hitting the main armour belt, then the belt itself could be made substantially thinner and thus either lighter, or it could cover a larger area, or you could do a halfway house of both, and still you expect to resist incoming fire. The potential for shells to lose their caps was already quite well known in the various major navies, as another way of causing this to happen was simply for the shell to impact at a relatively large angle to perpendicular. This effect was one of the secondary reasons for the advent of deliberately angling armour belts in the early 1920s, a trend which would continue in some navies into the 30s and 40s. The simplest way to effect decapping a shell deliberately and consistently was to just put an additional barrier ahead of the armour, so the shell would hit that first. This would just be a thinner sheet of steel. If this sheet of steel was thick enough, then it would exert enough force to break off whatever means was being used of holding the shell to the shell body, and potentially even shatter the armour-piercing cap completely if it was considerably thick, although in the latter case, a considerably thick decapping plate would probably negate most or all of the weight savings. But since this general effect could have potential implications for certain kinds of tank ammunition, or more precisely anti-tank ammunition, as well, a number of different nations would conduct a wide range of tests using both naval rounds to look at the implication of potentially decapping incoming shells to protect ships, but they would also use smaller rounds that would typically be found in various anti-tank weapons of the interwar period to see if what we would know as spaced armour could work for tanks, specifically against capped armour-piercing shells. Of course, there is value of spaced armour against early Heat and Hesh warheads as well, but that's a separate discussion. Now, of course, in the real world, the decapping effect of a sheet of steel would be affected by the angle of impact. But, at least for a battleship, if the alternative was a shell punching straight through intact and then hitting a thin main belt that would then also give way quite easily, it was best to assess these things according to a worst-case scenario, a perpendicular impact, or as close to as you are likely to get. Thanks to the various tests done by the different nations, it is possible to calculate not only how thick the decapping plate should be, but also how this might vary depending on the type of armour-piercing cap that a shell might be using. This has all been handily summarised in this chart by the late Nathan Oken, a fine scholar who wrote extensively on a variety of naval subjects, mostly to do with guns and armour, and with whom many of you will already be familiar. As you can see, to be on the safe side of things, while keeping the plate as light as possible, the ratio of plate thickness versus diameter of incoming shell should be at least 0.17. That's the upper boundary of the orange zone on the chart. So, going back to the Italians, they would test and then equip the Littorio class with an armour scheme that combined inclined armour, specifically at an angle of about 15 degrees, with the main belt being 280mm thick, or about 11 inches, which in and of itself would be immediately obvious as completely inadequate to deal with 15 or 16-inch projectiles that would be common in the late 1930s and early 1940s naval battles if left on its own, especially at the closer ranges that Reggio Marina thought the battleship fights might come down to, which would be 16,000 metres or about 17,000 yards. This also, however, had a decapping plate, and that was 70mm thick, or about 2.8 inches. So let's examine this at the first stage of things. Is the decapping plate actually thick enough to do its job? Well, the Reggio Marina assumed that a 15-inch shell was its most likely opposition, and so we apply the previously mentioned ratio. 0.17 of 15 inches is 2.55 inches, and so a 2.8-inch thick plate would suffice with a little bit of a safety margin. It's in fact even 0.08 of an inch thicker than the minimum needed to be reasonably reliable against a 16-inch projectile. And in either case, the angle of the armour and the angle of fall of the shell would help a little bit with this as well. Note, however, that 1.5 divided by 16 is about 0.094, which falls below the minimum ratio to knock any kind of cap off, even occasionally, and this is why the 1.5-inch STS outer plate on an Iowa-class battleship is not a decapping plate, something that Oken himself would confirm. Thus, the decapping plate on the Littorios should do its job of detaching the armour-piercing cap from the shell against pretty much any incoming threat, except possibly Yamato's 18.1-inch guns. But there is a second factor to consider: the distance between the decapping plate and the main belt. You see, once you've physically detached the armour-piercing cap from the shell body, i.e. you've broken the solder or contact points or whatever is involved, you then actually need the cap to physically separate from the shell by a certain distance, ideally completely. Otherwise, the cap is just sitting on top of the shell, just without anything holding it in one particular place, but then when it hits the main belt, the overall effect of that impact is likely to be similar as if nothing had actually happened at all, since the tip of the shell and the interior of the armour-piercing cap act a bit like a socket system anyway. Plus, there is a risk at closer distances, in terms of the distance between the decapping plate and the armour belt, that the decapping plate itself may be carried wrapped around the shell to the main belt, and thus in and of itself act like an additional armour-piercing cap layer. As again we've seen in the shells versus armour video, you could get a plug of metal being knocked out of an armour belt, and this was not uncommon when heavy caliber shells hit steel. So, you need to have a decapping gap between the decapping plate and the main armour belt. And this, as it turns out, is proportional to the size of the shell impacting and the relative thickness of the decapping plate to that shell. In the various tests tabulated, the largest minimum successful gap recorded at a perpendicular or normal impact was about 3 calibers, and the lowest was about 1.6 calibers, with the change being related to the decapping plate to shell caliber ratio. Luckily, there is another formula that allows us to calculate the decapping gap needed, since 2.8, that's 2.8 inches for the decapping plate, divided by 15 inches, that's the diameter of the shell that's being fired at it, is 0.1867. We can plug this in, and then we can see that the perpendicular impact against the Italian setup should need a intervening distance of 2.26 calibers, or about 34 inches, between the decapping plate and the main belt. But of course, the whole setup is angled at 15 degrees, and we know that the Italians were only expecting this setup to be effective at beyond 17,000 yards. So, testing against Littorio's own guns, which would have an approximately 9-degree angle of fall at that range, gives us a total incident angle of 24 degrees, 9 plus 15. This reduces the gap to 1.25 calibers. So we actually only need a gap of about 18.8 inches. Now, this is where we start to run into problems, as the gap between the decapping and main belts in the Littorios in reality is only about 25 centimeters or 9.84 inches. On the face of it, this would seem to immediately completely invalidate the armour scheme, as the distance involved is a little over half of what would seem to be needed. Additionally, the only time the scheme was actually tested was using a 12.6 inch or 320mm round. Normally, using a smaller gun to test armour is fine to a degree, since the main thing that you are testing for is impact energy. As we established in the video on shells versus armour, these tests were usually not carried out at true ranges, but rather the charge in the gun was reduced, thus reducing the muzzle velocity, and the angle of impact on the armour was modified, usually by changing the angle of the armour plate being tested, so that the shot could be taken at short range, where a hit could be guaranteed, but the angle and energy involved in the impact would be the same as if the shell had hit from much further away. Therefore, within certain boundaries, you could actually test to see what would happen if a 15-inch shell hit using a 12.6-inch shell by simply not reducing the 12.6-inch shell's charge by quite as much. And this would give you, assuming you did your calculations properly, a 12.6-inch shell that would hit at a given angle with the same amount of kinetic energy as a 15-inch shell hitting at that angle, simulating a particular range, as you were effectively simulating a 12.6-inch shell that was using a spectacularly unsafe and likely impossible starting charge, which had reduced it in flight time, and so its kinetic energy was the same as a more conventional 15-inch shell, which had just lost a little bit of energy. But unfortunately, in this case, as we've established, the diameter of the shell actually matters for the decapping effect, which is largely independent of the energy of the impact, providing that this is a speed of the shell above a certain amount, which is considerably lower than even extreme long-distance shots under realistic conditions, and so we can essentially ignore that factor. What this all adds up to is that the same 2.8-inch decapping plate represents a 0.1867 caliber thickness to a 15-inch shell, but a 0.222 caliber thickness to a 12.6-inch shell, meaning that the same thickness of decapping plate is going to be considerably more effective against the smaller shell. And indeed, using the same 24-degree angle of descent, which is what they would have tested for, since of course otherwise the Italians were testing for a 15-inch shell fired at 16 kilometers or 17,000 yards, the decapping distance to decap a 12.6-inch shell decreases by about an inch to 17.82 inches. Now, this is also still well in excess of the 9.84-inch actual distance between the plates, but proportionally, it's about 55% of what's needed as opposed to about 52% if you use an actual 15-inch round. And that, in turn, brings us on to our final mystery, because, you see, in other tests done to look at this situation, Krupp over in Germany had found that if you just filled the gap in with concrete between the decapping plate and the belt, you could cut the decapping distance by approximately half, thanks to the concrete having significantly greater resistance than air, and thus acting to split up the shell and cap faster. This would seem potentially to be a solution, since using concrete would put the system's effectiveness at just about marginal for a 15-inch round, which would make sense, as that is actually the lower boundary of range the Italians expected the system to be effective at. But not so fast. You see, concrete has a density of between 2.2 to 2.5 tons per cubic meter, depending on your mix. That is much lighter than steel, which hovers at around 7.7 to 8 tons per cubic meter, but it still represents a fair old bit of weight. bearing in mind that the decapping plate normally has a relatively marginal effect on the shell's velocity and thus its overall armor-piercing value if the cap doesn't detach. In the Italian system, if they had used concrete in the German fashion, you would then have a weight per square meter of the 288mm steel main plate, then the weight per square meter of another 250mm of concrete, and then another 70mm of the steel decapping plate. This adds up per square meter to 2.754 tons of steel and then another 600 kilos of concrete if we use typical density values from the ranges we mentioned a minute ago. So this gives us a total mass for the Italian armour system of 3.354 tons per square meter. That in turn equates to the same mass as a single steel plate 426mm or 16.77 inches thick, which would be somewhat thicker than the main belt of a Yamato-class battleship, and at a 24-degree total angle of fall, bearing in mind the angle of the armour and the angle of the shell, this would represent an approximately 18.35-inch or 466mm equivalent thickness of steel when Littorio's own guns would fire at it at a range of 16 kilometers or 17,000 yards. Now, using the Regia Marina's own test figures and calculations for general penetration, this would suggest that a single inclined belt of the aforementioned thickness, because this is the same mass, would protect the ship down to about 15 kilometers, which is a significant improvement. Or if you just wanted protection down to 16 kilometers, then you could save about 5% on your armor weight by thinning the plate out. So in this scenario, using concrete as an infill, the Italian setup would work, but it would be somewhat inefficient and overly complex, being a little bit heavier and a little bit bulkier than it needed to be as compared to just making a big slab of steel. However, the Regia Marina didn't fill the gap with concrete. Well, they kind of did. They used foamed concrete. Now that would save between 200 and 500 kilos per meter squared, depending on the density, as foamed concrete ranges quite widely depending on the mix. Now, if we say that perhaps using a given mix of foam concrete you would save about 300 kilos per meter squared, thus reducing the overall mass of the system per meter squared to about 3 tons, which is a nice round number, that would equate to a single plate thickness of about 15 inches, which would then put the protection of the Littorios using a single plate roughly on a par with that of the King George V class. However, this thickness of plate would, using the Italians' own testing figures, only offer resistance at a 90-degree angle down to about 19 kilometers or 21,000 yards, which would be about 3 kilometers less protection than desired. So it would seem that using foamed concrete is the winning factor. The scheme works in terms of saving weight, but giving you a better resistance than the equivalent weight in solid steel, even if it is a little bit bulkier than that. But there's one final issue, and this is the one that as yet I've been unable to solve. Remember that filling the gap with concrete helps to decrease the distance needed for decapping because of the greater intervening density. Foamed concrete is less dense, which we've just established. That saves weight, but it would also mean less resistance. Less resistance would mean an increase in the distance that you would need, and thus that might move the decapping gap past what was available. As of yet, I haven't been able to find anything that would be particularly helpful in determining the exact nature of change in resistance of foamed concrete versus solid concrete to a projectile passing through. You could be lazy and assume a linear relationship between the density of the concrete and the resistance, but it's almost certainly not going to be the case, in much the same way as stacking many 1-inch plates of steel doesn't give you the same value of protection as a single plate of steel of the same overall thickness. you'd have to take into account the strength of the individual cells that make up the concrete foam, the way that shock propagates through the entire structure, and various other factors. And all of that makes it more likely, to my mind, that there would be a relatively sharp fall-off in effectiveness that would then plateau out. Now, whether that would extend the overall decapping distance needed past the limits imposed by the Littorio's armour layout, and if so, by how much, and more interestingly, would that move the figure to sit between the figures for the 12.6-inch shell and the 15-inch shell, or would it move it beyond both of them, is something that merits further research, ideally by someone with the requisite computer modelling software, or else a lot of time and firearms for scale testing. But whatever the case, hopefully this gives you some insight into the discussion surrounding the Littorio's armour scheme, and why, therefore, I'm a little bit hesitant to assume that it would work exactly as effectively as is otherwise sometimes claimed. Although, to be fair, it would still offer a reasonable amount of resistance in most cases.